Hi guys, my name's Sarmad and I'm going to be presenting this workshop on why we value arguments. A little caveat at the start of this, while this is a largely beginner and intermediate targeted workshop, there are elements of this that might be helpful either as a refresher or as just something that you might be able to draw value from, regardless of where you're at with your journey in debating. To that effect, I'll try and include timestamps in the video description so that you're able to kind of skip forward to any sections that you might find particularly interesting. Cool. Um, Quick disclaimers before we get into what we're going to be talking about. One, this is not meant to be a prescription on how to build arguments or think about debates. This is just a broad framework that I found personally helpful. And there's a bunch of methods that you might learn yourself, that your coaches might have talked to you about, that judges might have kind of told you about, or that you might have come into on your own accord via your time in debating that you can apply within these frameworks. Second, that this is very obviously not a workshop that exists in isolation. This draws very heavily on work done by others, notably by Lucia and Shauka, and many others that have not been named here. So a number of thanks to them. Yeah, that's about it. So firstly, before we get into a lot of the more technical stuff, I just want to talk really quickly about what the function of debating is, and then why that I think matters. Ultimately, all the rules of it aside, debating is meant to be an act of persuasion. Anytime you attempt to persuade someone, there is a reason why you choose the claims that you do in order to convince them of your side. To kind of illustrate this, right? Let's say, for instance, you and a friend are having an argument about who the greatest athlete of all time is. You think it's Michael Phelps because Michael Phelps has a bunch of Olympic medals and has been really dominant at the Olympics. And your friend thinks that it's Messi because Messi is at the top of football, which is the most popular sport in the world. So he should be considered the greatest athlete of all time. Evidently, the thing that you both care about or that you both think matters in the conversation for what makes an athlete the greatest is different. The value judgment for your claims differs. This is natural. Ultimately, our experiences and a bunch of other factors influence how we build these values over time. However, insofar as this is an activity that deals in persuasion, it's important that we deconstruct what those values are when you construct or make or think of arguments, and then kind of try and one, make them more explicit and defend them, and two, figure out what the opposing value judgment is and engage with it directly. So for instance, in this situation, if you break down both the claims that are being talked about here, the value judgment underneath your argument is that the Olympics should be the barometer that defines the success of an athlete, which you can argue is because the Olympics are a space that was meant to be a celebration of the greatest athletes in the world, that it encompasses a number of nations and sports, etc., etc. Whereas for your friend, the value judgment has to do with the popularity of the sport and the athlete, and that being what defines greatness, not the venue of that activity, etc., etc. In any argument that you attempt to make, regardless of what the round is, regardless of what the context is, whether that be in debating or outside of it, anytime you make a claim, that value judgment will always exist. Attempt to find it, and you will have a much easier job convincing others, or at the very least, making explicit to others why you think the way that you do. Because if you can explain that value judgment, the reason for that claim makes a lot more sense versus just saying it. I hope that makes sense. Now, I think this is important because a lot of times, if you hear judges talk about a debate being parallel, or if you encounter a debate where it seems like you and the team that you're up against are running cases that don't seem to engage with one another very well, it's usually because you guys have different or slightly differing value judgments at the heart of your claims that neither team is really making explicit or attempting to kind of push against, and that becomes a bit of an issue. So for instance, in this house would ban zoos, if you on proposition are arguing your case on the basis of having an ethical responsibility towards animals and wanting to minimize suffering towards living creatures, and opposition says that banning zoos hurts the economy and makes people lose jobs, then because the value judgments under your claim are different, i.e., that you believe that you have an obligation towards animals, whereas the opposition believes that you ought to try and maximize utility for humans, whatever the cost that might be. Unless you're able to prove which of those two should be valued more, if both arguments are true, you essentially leave it up to the judge to figure out which seems more persuasive. That leaves too much up for interpretation. Probably should avoid that. Ideally, you want to try and directly engage in those things. More broadly, when you look at the value of an argument, I think there's three things that kind of build into it. There's the likelihood of the argument, i.e., to what extent are you able to prove that the claim that you are attempting to make via the emotion is going to be true. The second is the impact, i.e., what the scale of harm or benefit is, what the endpoint of the argument is, etc., and how well you're able to illustrate that endpoint. And the third is the weighing, i.e., why it is that impact or that endpoint is something that matters or something that should be given a lot of value within the round. The value judgment that we're talking about kind of exists within the realm of that of the impact and weighing, which hopefully should become more clear as we progress. And that initial conversation about the claim itself has to do with the likely analysis, i.e., you being able to prove something to be true, and the impact, i.e., the endpoint, to some extent. I think on this as well, I think it's helpful to think about responses this way too. So generally, whenever you talk to judges about responses, or when you think about the types of responses that you will encounter, this falls into three categories. The first has to do with truth value responses, i.e., deconstructive responses that attempt to argue that an argument just isn't true in its entirety. The second is an impact flip, i.e., that even if the process analysis for an argument is true, the endpoint of that argument is different in a way that is actually beneficial for your side. So for instance, if a team is attempting to argue that a particular government policy might lead to people showing up to vote more, if an impact flip on this might be to argue that because it pushes people to a particular brink, it makes them more apathetic, so they might just disengage with politics entirely. So now they don't just not vote, they also don't protest or rally, or any number of those things. So you attempt to take the steps that the emotion leads to and just paint a different outcome out of it. The third is counterweighing, i.e., that if a team has argued that there are particular reasons why an impact or an argument matters. So if they say X argument matters because it has a large scale of impact, that you say maybe that's true, or maybe the argument is true, but we think our arguments are more important because they have either more scale of impact, or B, they have depth of impact, and depth of impact matters more. Depth of impact, i.e., rather than affecting more people, they affect a slightly smaller number of people a lot more greatly, and we think that's more important because X, Y, and Z. Therefore, we think our argument is more important than their argument. Each of these responses has a different function in the round and becomes relevant depending on whether, like, either what speaker you are, how effectively an argument is proven, and how important it is to the round, etc., etc. So you ideally should be using all three of these, again, because all three of these target equally important parts of the value of an argument. So just figure out which is the most effective given the situation that you're in. Really quickly on this, on mitigation, because this tends to be a point of confusion for both judges and speakers at times. Mitigation just refers to a response that attempts to diminish any part of that equation without necessarily taking it out entirely. This can look like, for instance, if a team argues that, I don't know, in this household ban zoos, if proposition is arguing that zoos actually have really bad incentives because they want to cut costs, so they will do things like create smaller pens for animals, they will often not invest in medical tech, etc. As long as they can get away with keeping the zoo functional, they will maximize suffering as long as it means lower running costs. Opposition can mitigate this by saying, well, maybe there's a fear of public backlash, because if the animals are really, really sad, people will go on social media and say that that's bad. They won't go to the zoo, they won't buy as many tickets, so there's a loss of profits. This mitigates the initial argument, so it makes it uncertain to what extent that harm manifests or what the scale of that harm is, but it doesn't necessarily prove that the harm isn't true, because both those impacts can coexist. So when you're evaluating like how a round is progressing, um, and like how to deal with certain arguments, mitigation isn't a tool that takes an argument out, but it is a tool that can make arguments less persuasive or reduce their value to the extent that other positive arguments that you have introduced become valuable enough to win the round. Um, so they aren't independently debate winning, but they can be used to make other parts of your case more important by contrast. And so being mindful of how you're using mitigation and being aware of what specifically the response that you're offering does to the opposing argument is, I think, something that should be important. Having talked about that, and having talked about value judgments as a whole, I think it's important to draw a distinction here. So there's a bit of a misconception that principles, by and large, are independent or have to be independent of impact or practical outcome in order to be valuable. In the vast majority of cases, this is not what principles are supposed to do, right? Most principles are just really well-defined value judgments that exist to enhance certain types of endpoints. So for instance, if you are arguing a reparative principle and you say that we think that you ought to, I don't know, adopt things like, or implement a policy that might end up benefiting minorities, even if it doesn't, which is a large scale of impact generally, because we have an obligation towards those minorities. That principle, that reparative principle, is effective insofar as you can demonstrate that there is a reparative obligation that you are fulfilling, which might still require you to prove some practical, maybe not a practical outcome, but a fulfillment of that initial principle itself, right? And so in a lot of ways, principles and practical arguments at their best become parts of a larger whole within a case rather than independent things. Caveat here, there are independent non-consequentialist arguments that you can make, but those are usually instances where the motion itself is the endpoint that the argument is attempting to defend. So for instance, if your opposition in this house would restrict voting to people with high empathy, if you run a principle or if you run a non-consequentialist argument that says we think that a democracy can only be legitimate when all its citizens are allowed an ability to be able to kind of affect or influence it, you don't have to prove a practical endpoint if you can prove that argument, because the endpoint or the fulfillment of that, i.e. that proposition is restricting the ability to be able to exercise your agency, and opposition by contrast allows that, happens within the motion itself. And so again, be cognizant of what your principle is doing and be deliberate in how you use it. Cool. How do you then enhance the value of an argument, given what we have talked about in terms of the constituents of it? For the purposes of this workshop, there's three things I'm going to talk about. The first and the most comprehensive is going to be weighing, which breaks down further into analytical weighing and stylistic weighing, or elements of it that are analytical and stylistic. The second is going to be setup and framing, and the third is going to be comparativeness. Cool. On weighing, as a general note, weighing should be adaptive, so don't go into a round thinking that there is a certain weighing that you are going to use. Weighing is very heavily reliant on both the specifics of the motion, obviously, but also what the team opposite to you is running. So for instance, if in this house or ban zoos, your opposition also starts running an argument about how um, banning zoos leads to more animal suffering somehow, then probably your initial weighing of we have an obligation to prevent suffering for animals doesn't work unless you are able to adapt it to the specifics of the arguments within the round. Um, a lot of this relies on trial and error. A lot of this relies on like trying to build a sense for how you like to think about weighing the value, how you like to think about values of for arguments and building on them, etc. The section is not meant to be a prescription. It's not meant to tell you the correct way to do this, because there is no correct way to do this. It's just meant to be an explanation of the functions and parts of weighing, so that you are better able to find a way to handle or use those parts. Cool. On analytical weighing, there's, I think, two subcategories here. The first is outcome-based weighing, and the second is round dynamics-based weighing. So substantive weighing and meta weighing. Substantive weighing refers to weighing that is directly tied to endpoints of arguments. This looks like, again, things like scale, i.e. how many people your argument affects, depth, how much those people are affected, vulnerability, how much the people that are affected need that effect. So like, for instance, if it is like offering jobs, are the people that are being offered jobs people who otherwise are quite poor off, or might come from vulnerable backgrounds? Responsibility, i.e. to what extent the person who is enacting the action, the motion, has a responsibility towards the people affected by that action. So if it is an action taken by a state towards particular minority communities, does that state owe a special responsibility towards those people? There's a number of ways that you can do this. Thing I want to caveat here is this has to be comparative. So like, while it is okay to construct these in isolation in prep, you should still be thinking about what the likely op case is when you do it. And when the debate happens and the op case presents itself, the weighing needs to adapt to be comparative to the opposition arguments. We'll talk about that more extensively in a second, but again, I cannot emphasize this enough. Just make sure that you are aware of what is happening in the round and are positioning your arguments in relation to that. Second thing, or the second type of weighing, i.e. round dynamics and meta weighing, has to do with the specifics of either the motion's phrasing. So things like the burdens within a supports motion versus a would motion versus a believes motion, or like things that have to do with the debate as it unfolds. So for instance, this looks like a third speaker potentially attempting to weigh arguments based on how likely those arguments have been proven to be true, based on different responsive exchanges, etc. Things like nuance, i.e. whether the argument that is being presented is one that is able to take advantage of the exact change of the emotion to the best, fullest of its extent, or things like responsiveness, i.e. whether the argument is important because it addresses other things that are happening in the round, if other arguments are contingent on the thing that it is attempting to resolve, or whether it responds to other claims, and whether that responsiveness is able to change how other clashes play out. So when you are attempting to engage in weighing, try and like, I guess the categories don't really matter beyond just understanding that weighing has different functions, and you ought to be attempting to see how you can best fulfill all of those functions. Meta weighing as a broad way to think about it might refer to or encompass a lot of the things that you traditionally associate with either reply speeches or judge or OAs. And so integrating parts of those can be helpful in terms of influencing the perception of a round, or taking advantage of strategic mistakes that a team makes, etc., in a way that is beneficial to the persuasiveness of your case. There's a number of ways you can engage in this. The purpose of this workshop is not necessarily to go over all of them, so it's going to quickly move on. On style. And this is going to be a bit of a longer one. So I want to caveat that there are a number of things that play into how style or how an argument is perceived by a listener. The most obvious and the ones that are going to be talked about here are things like illustration, so how well you're able to create a picture of the world in a judge's mind. Emotions, how well you're able to adapt your delivery. That has to do with things like tone, body language, space, etc. and then use of language, i.e. how your choice of words affects the overall persuasiveness of an argument as it is delivered on the floor. Importantly, these are not interchangeable. They're additive. That is, that really, really good use of language does not mean that you don't have to be effectively emotive. Being emotive will always be helpful additional to the use of language, in the same way that illustration will always be helpful in addition to emotiveness, and language will always be helpful in addition to illustrativeness. So just when you are attempting to construct arguments, try and think about how you can use these in tandem with one another to enhance the perceived function of the argument as you think of it. On language first, I think it's important to recognize that people have different associations with words that might otherwise have very similar meanings, and those the different implications of those words can really, really affect how that argument ends up playing out in a round. For example, there is a very clear difference, even though these are essentially saying the same thing, between arguing that it is bad to take away people's choices because that is what makes them who they are, versus saying that it is morally abhorrent to rob people of their agency that defines their being and dignity. Being able to pick and use language that brings out the extent of the argument to its fullest is almost always going to have a really, really big effect on how judges are going to perceive those arguments. And I want to note, this is not just about extreme language. So if, for instance, you attempt to make a similarly, dramatic claim in a round that has to do with tax forms, for instance, or a marginal, increase in some regulation on seatbelts, it might be seen as being overly, not polarizing, but it might be seen as going a bit too far in the other direction. The use of language doesn't just matter because you're trying to find the words that are the most, that have the largest effect in general. It matters because you want to find the words that resonate most deeply with the type of argument that you are making and the intention behind that argument. That can have to do with the kind of emotional effect that you want the argument to have. That can have to do with the severity that you perceive the argument to have and how much you want that to be reflected in your language. Just generally, it is helpful to be cognizant of the effect of such semantics on the perception of the argument. Second thing on illustration, again, so a few things here. One, that illustration can be an exercise in storytelling and descriptive picture painting, in which case this becomes very, very closely tied to your ability to use language and to emotively deliver or explain those pictures. On what illustration is meant to accomplish, there's a few things. I think point number 3 talks about this in terms of it being a tool for impacting, but a lot of times the value of an argument is most clear when you are able to see, especially when it is meant to be a consequentialist one, when you can see very vividly what happens to people as a result of its presence or non-presence. And that requires two things, right? One, it just in general, very obviously, requires you to be illustrative, to be descriptive, and to be emotive in that description. But the other thing that it requires is for you to be comparative. So if you are painting a picture of how bad things are on proposition side, if they are not able to prevent the IMF from handing out certain loans to global south countries, you also need to do the work to demonstrate what the world looks like if the IMF doesn't hand out those loans. So that has two parts. One, analytically, you need to demonstrate what the alternative is. And two, illustratively, you need to demonstrate why that alternative is better compared to the picture that you painted of the other side. As with most things in debating, illustration is most effective when it is used in comparison to stuff that the other team is saying, or that the other team is likely to say, or that you think will happen on the other team's side. The second part of this is that given that the function of illustration is to try and appeal to people's emotional sensibilities, a way that you can supplement them is by using effective analogies as a way to connect those arguments or those illustrations to things that people generally care about or value. And obviously the caveat here is that you need to make sure that you are able to justify that connection, right? So for instance, if you are connecting a particular form of taxation to a, again, to a way of taking away people's labor, then you need to talk about why it is that taxation has that role. But being able to draw those analogies might be something that is effective as a way of enhancing that illustration, because you're able to draw from sensibilities people already have, which means that you don't necessarily have to do as much work to build up those. And this is particularly relevant in cases where motions or arguments talk about things that are not common sense for people in general. So helpful to keep in mind. Third thing on tone, pacing, and body language, and this by and large goes into what we consider emotiveness, right? Now, sometimes we talk about these things in a bit of a general sense. So we say things like the tone of the tonal variation of a speaker was good, or that their pacing was good, or that they had good body language. These things don't mean much unless we're able to place or understand what the relevance of that tonal variation or that pacing or that body language is with the arguments that are being delivered, right? So a lot of speakers, if you look, there's a bunch of recorded rounds that you can look at from WSTC, etc. And what you, I think, as a general trend will notice is that the most stylistic speakers, the ones that tend to be praised the most, that tend to score the highest in that category, are speakers who are able to identify how their use of tone, how their use of language, and their control of the room via their body language plays a role in the specific type of argument that is being presented and how it's perceived. So for instance, when you are making an argument about ethnic violence and genocide, that argument probably needs to be delivered differently than an argument about the narrative of sports and the importance of it in people's lives. I think a lot of times there's a tendency to default, as you kind of find a style that works for you in general, into a kind of two-tonal thing where you have a sort of animated emotion, whether that be anger, whether that be humor, whether that be sarcasm, etc. And that becomes the stylistic kind of enhancement mode, and then there is a slightly calmer, toned down mode, and speakers alternate between one or the other. This is good, but this is not ideal. Ideally, you want to be able to access a wider range of emotions depending on what it is that you want an argument to be able to elicit within the judge. So if, for instance, a part of your speech is supposed to be somber because it's referring to a particularly devastating tragedy or a particular type of violence that is supposed to be egregious or perceived as being egregious, being able to slow down, just be calm, and emphasize the gravity of that is probably going to be more important, even if you are slightly worse at it initially, than just going back into that angry tone that you default into, versus if you are attempting to respond to an argument that is particularly uncharitable or is particularly unrealistic, using humor and being animated in the way in which you respond to it is probably something that you can draw a lot of value from, that you can use to make a judge agree with you that the argument maybe did not deserve as much credit as the speaker who delivered it might have wanted it to have brought with it. Thinking about these things, I think, is important. And this is not because you know this or because you've heard this, you will do this. But as a general thing to work towards, I think this can be quite helpful. This also applies, obviously, with different parts of speeches. So if you are in the middle of your impacting, your pacing probably benefits from slowing down a bit because you want the judge to know what your arguments are doing in the round. Whereas if you are attempting to cover a lot of analysis, for instance, you might want to speed up a bit to kind of cover that as fast as possible, because that's the, I guess, the emotive perception of that analysis is slightly less important. So again, like small considerations like that become relevant there in determining what the overall stylistic quality of a speech is, and they can play a big role in how the how arguments values are perceived as a whole. Cool. Then on setup and framing, and this is not going to be very extensive, but there's a couple of things that I want to point out here. One, that given the function of setup and framing has to do with the ability for you to forward certain arguments. If you are spending time setting up parts of the debate, you should at the very least in your own mind have a clear reason for, in terms of what you are arguing, why it is that matters. Even if it is just that that setup seems important to have a basis for those arguments. A lot of times, first speakers and teams as a whole will spend a bit of time going through a bunch of stakeholders that they never end up talking about in their case, which seems like a bit of a waste of space. If there are stakeholders that you are identifying as being relevant, try and talk about how they're affected when you make your arguments. And if you don't think that they're affected, or if your arguments don't cater to them, then it might not be the best use of your time to kind of paint them or establish them as being a part of the round. A bunch of other small things like that, I think, can be helpful. The other thing, having to do with framing, and I think this one is particularly important, is that a lot of times, in particular types of rounds, teams will have a tendency to argue the debate in two different contexts and either not move past them and just stay locked in them, or to not do a very good job of applying the argument even after they've moved past it. In every round or in every motion, there will be a set of cases that is helpful or relevant to your side. There will be a set of cases that exists in the median between both the ideal world for prop and op, and there will be a set of cases that is ideal for the team opposing you. Shauka talks about this as 10-80-10. So 10% of cases on your side, 10% of cases on the opposing side, and 80% somewhere in between. You should be able to identify what those contexts are, and you should be able to ensure that even if you want to focus on your 10%, that your argument's impacts can be applied, or that you find a way to make them relevant across those contexts. And the other thing that you can do once you identify those contexts is you can spend time painting out either why your contexts are the ones that ought to be valued the most in the round, or B, why those contexts are just more likely, right? Again, so this is a consideration to think about that can play into how an argument is perceived in terms of its relevance. Lastly, on tracking and comparatives. This has been a bit of a theme throughout the workshop, so I'm not going to spend too much time on the comparativeness element of this. Again, just identify differences and explain the tipping points that result in them. But the thing that I want to flag is that in order to be comparative, you need to be able to have a clear understanding of the exact difference between your world and the world of the team opposing you. And in order to do that, you need to be able to comprehensively track what it is that the other team is saying and what it is that your own speakers have actually said in the round from as neutral a perspective as possible, so that you have a clear understanding of where the debate is at from a bystander's perspective. So try and be charitable, not just because it leads to better debates, but because it helps you make more persuasive comparatives when you are able to take the version of the argument that people are actually hearing and then dismantling it, versus dismantling a version of an argument that might be perceived as being slightly more uncharitable. I think that's about it. If there are any questions, obviously this is not a live workshop, unfortunately. However, this is on YouTube, so that means there is a comment section. Feel free to yell at me there, and I will try and respond as soon as I can. Beyond that, that's it from my end. Good luck for nationals.